We should connect next week to finalize the proposal.
Absolutely. Let me get your card.
The champagne glass in Delilah Renee Harrison's hand trembled slightly as she stood beside her husband in the grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton in downtown Atlanta, surrounded by the city's business elite. She was wearing an elegant midnight blue gown that her mother had helped her pick out, her natural hair styled in soft curls that framed her face. And she had spent 2 hours getting ready because tonight was supposed to be important. Tonight was the annual gala for Whitmore Financial Group, the investment firm where her husband Sterling had worked for the past 8 years, climbing from junior analyst to senior portfolio manager. Sterling had told her this event was crucial for his career, that impressions mattered, that she needed to look the part of a successful executive's wife. What Sterling had not told her, what Delilah was about to discover in the most humiliating way possible, was that he was ashamed of her. They had been standing near the bar for 20 minutes when one of Sterling's colleagues approached with his wife, a perfectly coiffed woman in her 50s, wearing enough diamonds to fund a small country. The colleague, a vice president named Jonathan, smiled warmly and extended his hand to Sterling before turning his attention to Delilah. "And who is this lovely lady?" Jonathan asked. Sterling's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on Delilah's elbow, and when he spoke, his voice carried a casual dismissiveness that made her stomach drop. "Oh, this is Delilah. She helps out around the house." There was a beat of confused silence. Jonathan's wife looked between Sterling and Delilah, clearly trying to reconcile Sterling's words with the fact that Delilah was dressed as elegantly as any other wife at the gala, and was standing at Sterling's side with obvious familiarity. "She helps out?" Jonathan repeated, his confusion evident. "Household staff," Sterling said, his tone suggesting the topic was beneath discussion. "Very reliable. Hard to find good help these days." Delilah felt the words hit her like a physical blow. She stood there, champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips, unable to process what her husband of 12 years had just said. Unable to comprehend that he had just introduced her, his wife, the mother of his 2 children, as the maid. Jonathan's wife had the grace to look horrified, her eyes widening as she glanced at Delilah's left hand, where a wedding ring clearly sat. But before anyone could say anything else, Sterling was already steering Delilah away, his grip on her elbow tight enough to hurt. "What are you doing?" Delilah hissed once they were out of earshot. "Playing the game," Sterling said coldly. "You wouldn't understand." Before Delilah could respond, before she could demand an explanation or walk out or do any of the things her dignity screamed at her to do, the lights in the ballroom dimmed, and a voice came over the sound system asking everyone to take their seats for dinner in the evening's program. Sterling guided Delilah to a table near the back of the room, far from the stage where the company's executives would be sitting. As they sat down, Delilah noticed that the other people at their table were mostly junior employees and their dates, not the senior management Sterling constantly claimed to be networking with. She was about to ask him about this when the CEO of Whitmore Financial Group, an older white man named Richard Whitmore, took the stage. Richard welcomed everyone, made the usual remarks about the company's success and the importance of the people in the room, and then said something that made Delilah's heart skip a beat. "Before we begin dinner, I want to introduce someone very special who has agreed to host our silent auction this evening. She is a remarkable woman who has built an incredible nonprofit organization that aligns perfectly with Whitmore Financial's commitment to community investment. Please join me in welcoming the founder and executive director of the Heritage Arts Foundation, Mrs. Delilah Renee Harrison." The room erupted in applause. Delilah sat frozen in her seat, her brain struggling to catch up with what was happening. Beside her, Sterling had gone completely pale, his mouth slightly open in shock. "That's you," someone at their table whispered. "You need to go up there." Delilah stood on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment. She walked toward the stage in a daze, aware of hundreds of eyes on her, aware of Sterling's shocked face tracking her movement, aware that something monumental was happening, but not quite able to process it yet. Richard Whitmore met her at the steps to the stage, offering his hand to help her up, his smile warm and genuine. "Mrs. Harrison, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. Your foundation's work is extraordinary. Now, before we go any further, if you are already hooked on this story, And if you can feel Delilah's shock and confusion, and you absolutely need to know how this situation unfolds, then stop right now and hit that subscribe button. Here is something most people do not realize. Over 70% of the people watching Philly Folktales videos right now have not subscribed to this channel. You watch, you feel every emotion, you get completely absorbed in these stories, and then you move on without joining our community. Do not be one of those people. Subscribe right now and become part of the Philly Folktales family. Smash that like button because it genuinely helps these stories reach more people who need to hear them. And drop a comment telling me where you are watching from. Atlanta, Detroit, Houston, London, Lagos. I want to hear from every single one of you because what happens next, the way this evening unfolds and the truth about Delilah's life comes to light is something you will not forget. Delilah took the microphone with hands that had stopped shaking, replaced now by something else. Clarity. She looked out at the crowd, at all these people in their expensive clothes and their practiced smiles, and she saw Sterling sitting at the back table, looking like he might be sick. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," Delilah said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I am honored to be here tonight. For those of you who do not know, the Heritage Arts Foundation provides arts education and cultural programming to underserved communities throughout Atlanta. We believe that every child deserves access to music, theater, visual arts, and the cultural heritage that connects them to their history and identity." She went on to describe the silent auction items, beautiful pieces donated by local artists, all while her mind raced with questions. How did Richard Whitmore know about her foundation? Why had he asked her to host the auction? And most importantly, did he know she was married to Sterling? When she finished her remarks and the auction was officially opened, Richard guided her off the stage and immediately introduced her to several board members and major donors, all of whom seemed genuinely interested in her work. It was surreal. These were the same people Sterling had been trying to impress for years, and they were treating Delilah like she was someone important, someone worth knowing. Your foundation came highly recommended," Richard said during a quiet moment. "One of our board members, Carolyn Jenkins, sits on your advisory council. She has been singing your praises for months. When we were looking for someone to highlight our community investment focus, your name came up immediately." Carolyn Jenkins. Delilah knew Carolyn, a retired executive who had joined the Heritage Arts Advisory Council 2 years ago and had been instrumental in opening doors for funding and partnerships. But Delilah had no idea Carolyn was on the Whitmore Financial Board. "I did not realize the connection," Delilah said honestly. "Well, we are thrilled to have you here. And I believe your husband works for us? Sterling Harrison? He must be very proud." Delilah's smile felt frozen on her face. "Yes, Sterling works here." "Wonderful. You will have to bring him by so I can congratulate him on having such an accomplished wife." The irony was so thick, Delilah could have choked on it. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Delilah networked with donors, answered questions about her foundation, and watched the silent auction raise over $50,000 for their programs. She was aware of Sterling watching her from across the room, his expression unreadable, but she did not approach him. She was not ready for that conversation yet. When the gala finally ended and people began to leave, Sterling appeared at her side, his hand possessive on her lower back in a way it had not been earlier. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "Yes," Delilah agreed. "We do." They barely spoke on the drive home. Sterling's jaw was tight, his hands gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. Delilah stared out the window at the passing lights of Atlanta, her mind replaying the evening's events over and over. When they pulled into the driveway of their modest home in a middle-class neighborhood, a home that was significantly less impressive than the ones Sterling's colleagues likely lived in, Sterling finally exploded. "Why did you not tell me you were going to be at the gala?" Delilah looked at him incredulously. "Why did I not tell you?" "Sterling, I did not know I was going to be there. Richard Whitmore's assistant called me 3 weeks ago and asked if I would host the silent auction. I thought it was just a regular charity event. I had no idea it was your company's gala." "You should have mentioned it." "Why?" "So you could tell me not to go. So you could make sure your colleagues did not find out you are married to someone who actually does meaningful work instead of just attending country club lunches?" Sterling flinched. That is not fair. Not fair? You introduced me as the maid, Sterling. The maid, how is that fair? I panicked, okay? Jonathan and his wife, they are old money. They have certain expectations. I did not know how to explain. Explain what? That you married someone who came from a working-class family? That my parents were not wealthy? That I did not go to an Ivy League school? What exactly is so embarrassing about me that you had to pretend I was the help? Sterling was silent, which was answer enough. Delilah felt something break inside her, something that had been cracking for years but had finally shattered completely. And how long have you been ashamed of me? I am not ashamed of you, Sterling said, but his voice lacked conviction. Yes, you are. You have been for years. That is why you never invite me to office events. Why you make excuses when your colleagues ask about your wife. Why you moved us to this neighborhood instead of somewhere closer to your work friends. You have been hiding me. That is not true. Then why did not you tell your boss you were married to me? Why did Richard Whitmore have no idea that the woman he invited to host his gala is your wife? Sterling had no answer for that. Delilah went inside, leaving Sterling sitting in the car. She checked on their two children, both asleep in their rooms, blissfully unaware that their mother's world had just shifted on its axis. Then she went to the bedroom, took off the beautiful blue gown, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, trying to figure out what came next. Over the next few days, Delilah did what she always did when she needed to think. She threw herself into her work. The Heritage Arts Foundation had grown from a small after-school program she started in a church basement 10 years ago into a thriving nonprofit with multiple locations, dozens of instructors, and hundreds of children whose lives were enriched by access to arts education they otherwise could not afford. It was Delilah's passion, her purpose, the thing she was most proud of in her life besides her children. Sterling had never understood it. To him, the foundation was a hobby, something Delilah did to keep busy since she only worked part-time to be available for their kids. But he had no idea that the foundation had a six-figure budget, that Delilah had secured grants from major corporations, that she managed a staff of 15 and had been featured in local news outlets for her innovative programming. He had never asked, and Delilah had stopped trying to tell him. On Wednesday afternoon, Delilah's phone rang with a number she did not recognize. When she answered, she was surprised to hear Richard Whitmore's voice. "Mrs. Harrison, I hope I am not catching you at a bad time." "Not at all, Mr. Whitmore. What can I do for you?" "I wanted to thank you again for hosting the auction on Saturday. It was a tremendous success, and we received excellent feedback from our guests. Several people asked how they could get involved with your foundation." "That is wonderful to hear." Thank you for the opportunity." There was a pause. Then Richard said, "Mrs. Harrison, I am going to be direct with you because I respect your time and your intelligence. I learned something after the gala that concerns me, and I wanted to address it with you personally." Delilah's stomach tightened. "What is that?" "I learned that you are married to Sterling Harrison, one of our portfolio managers, and I learned that Sterling did not disclose this connection when I mentioned we were bringing you in for the gala." "I see. I also learned through some very uncomfortable conversations with employees who were at your table that evening that Sterling introduced you to colleagues as household staff rather than as his wife." Delilah closed her eyes. Of course people had talked. Of course the story had spread through the office. "Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate your concern, but what happens between Sterling and me is personal." "Normally I would agree," Richard interrupted gently, "but when one of our employees treats anyone, let alone his own wife, with that level of disrespect in a professional setting, it becomes my concern. It speaks to character, and character matters at Whitmore Financial." Delilah did not know what to say to that. "I am calling for two reasons," Richard continued. "First, to apologize on behalf of the company for putting you in that position. If I had known you were Sterling's wife, I would have handled the invitation differently. Second, to tell you that Whitmore Financial would like to become a major sponsor of the Heritage Arts Foundation. We were already impressed with your work, but after seeing you in action at the gala, seeing how you handled yourself with grace and professionalism, despite what must have been an incredibly difficult situation, I am even more convinced that your organization aligns with our values." Delilah felt tears prick her eyes. "Mr. Whitmore, I do not know what to say. Say you will accept a $50,000 sponsorship to expand your programming, and say you will consider joining our Community Investment Advisory Board. We need people like you, people who are actually doing the work and making a difference, to guide how we allocate our charitable giving. Yes to both. Thank you. After she hung up, Delilah sat in her office and cried. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that while her husband had been ashamed of her, other people, important people, saw her value, saw her worth, recognized the work she had poured her heart into for a decade. That evening, when Sterling came home from work, he was quieter than usual. He kissed the kids, asked about their homework, and then retreated to his home office. Delilah made dinner, fed the children, and helped them with their bedtime routine. It was only after the kids were asleep that Sterling emerged and asked if they could talk. They sat in the living room, and Sterling looked more vulnerable than Delilah had seen him in years. I talked to Richard Whitmore today, Sterling said. So did I. Sterling looked up sharply. He called you? Yes, to apologize for putting me in an awkward position and to offer a major sponsorship for my foundation. Sterling was quiet for a long moment. He called me into his office. He asked me point blank why I had not told him my wife was the person he invited to host the gala. Asked me why multiple employees reported that I introduced you as household staff. What did you tell him? The truth, that I made a terrible mistake, that I let my own insecurities and anxieties about fitting in with people I perceived as more successful or more connected make me behave in a way that was inexcusable. Delilah waited. He told me that the way I treated you reflected poorly on my character and judgment. He said that Whitmore Financial values integrity and respect, and that my behavior violated both. He put me on formal notice that any similar conduct in the future would result in termination. Sterling? He was right, Sterling said, his voice breaking slightly. Everything he said was right. Delilah, and I have been so focused on climbing the ladder, on proving myself to people whose opinions should not matter more than yours, that I lost sight of who I actually am and what I actually have. You built something incredible. You are incredible. And I have spent years minimizing your accomplishments because they reminded me that you were succeeding at something meaningful while I was just making rich people richer. Delilah had imagined this conversation going many different ways, but she had not expected this level of honesty. You hurt me, she said simply. You humiliated me. In front of hundreds of people, you denied our marriage, our partnership, our life together. How am I supposed to come back from that? I do not know if you can, Sterling admitted. I do not know if I deserve for you to even try. But I need you to know that I see it now. I see what I did. I see what I have been doing for years, and I am ashamed, not of you, of myself. The weeks that followed were difficult in ways Delilah had not anticipated. Sterling went to therapy, both individual and couples counseling that Delilah agreed to attend, despite her uncertainty about the marriage. He was making visible efforts to change, to be more present, to actually see Delilah and the life she had built instead of viewing her through the lens of his own insecurities. But trust, once broken, was not easily repaired. Delilah threw herself into the foundation's expansion, using the Whitmore Financial sponsorship to hire additional instructors and open 2 new program sites in underserved neighborhoods. So she joined the company's Community Investment Advisory Board and discovered that she had a real gift for strategic philanthropy, for identifying programs that needed support and helping corporations understand how their investment could create lasting change. She also started being more honest with herself about her marriage. With the help of her therapist, Delilah began to recognize patterns she had ignored for years. The way Sterling had slowly isolated her from his professional life. The way he had discouraged her from expanding the foundation, suggesting she should focus more on the kids, or that nonprofit work was nice, but not really a career. The way he had made her feel like her accomplishments were hobbies while his were important. It was not overt abuse. It was something more subtle, more insidious. It was death by 1,000 small dismissals, 1,000 tiny moments where Sterling had chosen his image over their partnership. 3 months after the gala, Delilah received a call from Carolyn Jenkins, the board member who had recommended her to Richard Whitmore. Delilah, I have a proposition for you, Carolyn said. How would you feel about turning the Heritage Arts Foundation into something bigger? I have been talking to some contacts, and there is significant interest in creating a regional network of arts education programs using your model. We are talking about expansion into 5 cities, a multi-million-dollar budget, and the kind of impact that could change the landscape of arts access in the Southeast. Delilah's heart raced. That sounds incredible, but also overwhelming. I do not know if I have the capacity to manage something that large. That is why we would build a proper infrastructure, hire a staff, bring in experienced nonprofit administrators. You would move into an executive director role focused on vision and strategy rather than day-to-day operations. This is your work, Delilah, your vision, but we want to help you scale it to reach thousands of kids instead of hundreds. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. It was also terrifying. That evening, Delilah told Sterling about the offer. She watched his face carefully, looking for signs of the old dismissiveness, the subtle ways he might minimize or discourage her. Instead, Sterling smiled, and it looked genuine. That is amazing, Delilah. You should absolutely do it. It would mean a lot of time commitment, travel, late nights. Why, the kids will be fine. I will step up. I have already been working on being more present anyway. This is your moment. You have to take it. Delilah wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that this new version of Sterling, the one who went to therapy and acknowledged his mistakes and seemed genuinely supportive, was real and lasting. But she was also cautious. Over the next 6 months, Delilah built the infrastructure for the expanded Heritage Arts Network. She hired an experienced nonprofit administrator as COO, brought in development staff to manage fundraising, and began the process of establishing partner sites in Charlotte, Nashville, Birmingham, and Charleston. The work was exhilarating and exhausting, and Delilah had never felt more alive, more purposeful, and more certain that this was what she was meant to be doing. Sterling did step up at home. He took over morning routines with the kids, managed dinner more often, attended parent-teacher conferences and soccer games that he used to miss for work. He seemed genuinely proud of Delilah's success, bragging about her work to his colleagues and even bringing their kids to the office to show them where Daddy worked and introduce them to people who asked about the amazing work your mother is doing. It was healing. Slowly, carefully, Delilah began to trust again. Not fully, not without caution, but enough to believe that maybe their marriage could survive this, that maybe they could build something new on the foundation of hard truth and genuine change. A year after the gala, Whitmore Financial held another charity event, this one a golf tournament and dinner to benefit the Heritage Arts Network. Richard Whitmore had personally championed making Delilah's organization the beneficiary, and the event raised over $200,000. Sterling attended with Delilah, and when people asked who she was, he introduced her with obvious pride as, "My wife, Delilah Harrison, the founder and executive director of the Heritage Arts Network." During the dinner, Richard pulled Sterling aside for a conversation that Sterling recounted to Delilah later that evening. He told me that watching the change in me over the past year, seeing me actually show up as a partner to you instead of an obstacle, was one of the most encouraging things he had witnessed in his career, Sterling said. He said that growth is rare and that most people, when confronted with their failures, just make excuses or double down. But that I had actually done the work to change, and it showed. How did that make you feel? Delilah asked. Honestly, it made me realize how close I came to losing everything that actually matters. If you had not been strong enough to demand better, if you had just accepted my behavior or walked away entirely, I would have lost you and the kids and never understood what I threw away. Delilah reached across the table and took his hand. I am glad you are hearing it, but Sterling, you have to know that this is not finished. Trust takes time to rebuild. And I need to know that when things get hard, when you feel insecure or anxious, you will not go back to old patterns. I know, and I am committed to that, for as long as it takes. They were not perfect. They still had arguments, still had moments of tension and old wounds that had not fully healed, but they were honest now in ways they had not been before. They talked about hard things. They went to therapy. They built new patterns of communication and support. And Delilah stopped minimizing herself. She stopped making her accomplishments smaller to make Sterling feel bigger. She took up space. She celebrated her success. She let herself be proud of the work she had built in the lives she was changing. 2 years after the gala, the Heritage Arts Network was featured in a national magazine article about innovative approaches to arts education. The piece included a photo of Delilah at one of their program sites, surrounded by children engaged in a painting class, her face radiant with joy and purpose. Sterling framed the article and hung it in his office at work. When colleagues asked about it, he told them proudly about his wife's work, about the network's expansion, about the thousands of children whose lives were being enriched because Delilah refused to accept that access to arts education was a privilege rather than a right. The irony was not lost on Delilah. The same man who had once been too ashamed to acknowledge her was now using her success as a badge of honor. She chose to see it as growth rather than hypocrisy. She chose to believe that people could change, that redemption was possible, that marriages could survive betrayal if both people were willing to do the hard work of rebuilding. But she also knew that she would never again depend on Sterling's validation for her sense of worth. She had learned that lesson too well. Her value was not determined by whether her husband was proud of her or whether his colleagues were impressed. Her value came from the work itself, from the children she served, from the vision she had turned into reality. 3 years after the gala, Delilah was invited to speak at a national conference on nonprofit leadership. The room was full of executive directors, board members, and philanthropists, all eager to learn about sustainable models for arts education in underserved communities. During the Q&A session after her presentation, a young woman raised her hand and asked, "How did you find the courage to keep going when people did not believe in your vision?" Delilah thought about the question carefully. She thought about Sterling's dismissiveness in the early years. She thought about the gala, about standing in that ballroom and hearing her husband introduce her as the help. She thought about the moment on stage when Richard Whitmore had called her name, and she realized that other people saw value in her work even if Sterling had not. "I think courage comes from knowing that your work matters regardless of who acknowledges it," Delilah said finally. "There were people in my life, including people very close to me, who did not understand or value what I was trying to build. And for a long time, I let that diminish my sense of what was possible. But the truth is, the work speaks for itself. If you are serving a real need, if you are creating genuine impact, eventually that becomes undeniable. Your job is to keep showing up, keep doing the work, and trust that the right people will recognize its value when they are ready to see it." The room erupted in applause, and Delilah saw several people wiping tears from their eyes. After the session, dozens of people approached her to share their own stories of being underestimated, dismissed, or told their work did not matter. And every single one of them thanked her for the reminder that their value was not dependent on external validation. That evening, Delilah called Sterling from her hotel room. "How did it go?" he asked. "It went well, really well. I think people connected with the message." "I am proud of you," Sterling said, and Delilah believed him. "Thank you. Now, and how are the kids?" "Good. They miss you. We all do." After they hung up, Delilah sat in the quiet hotel room and reflected on how far she had come. From the woman who stood in that ballroom 3 years ago, humiliated and dismissed, to the woman who had just inspired hundreds of nonprofit leaders to trust in their own vision and worth. The journey had not been easy. It had required confronting hard truths about her marriage, about Sterling's character, about her own complicity in accepting treatment that she should never have tolerated. It had required building boundaries, demanding respect, and being willing to walk away if that respect was not forthcoming. But it had also led to growth, both for Delilah and for Sterling. It had led to honest conversations and real change. It had led to a marriage that was not perfect, but was built on a foundation of truth rather than pretense. And most importantly, it had led to Delilah fully owning her power, her voice, and her value. 5 years after the gala, the Heritage Arts Network had expanded to 10 cities and was serving over 5,000 children annually. Delilah had been recognized with numerous awards for her work, including being named one of the top nonprofit leaders in the Southeast by a major philanthropy journal. The organization's budget had grown to over $3 million, and they had a waiting list of cities wanting to establish partner programs. Sterling had been promoted to vice president at Whitmore Financial, a position he achieved through genuine merit and hard work, rather than the schmoozing and image management he had once prioritized. He credited the promotion to lessons he learned from watching Delilah lead with integrity and authenticity rather than pretense. Their marriage had settled into something that felt solid, if not always easy. They had learned to communicate through conflict rather than avoiding it. They had built a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine support rather than traditional gender roles and unstated expectations. But Delilah had also learned something crucial. She had learned that she did not need her marriage to survive. She loved Sterling, and she was committed to their partnership. But she knew now that she could stand on her own, that her identity was not dependent on being someone's wife, that her worth was not measured by whether her husband was proud of her. That knowledge, that certainty of self, changed everything. One evening, Delilah and Sterling were invited to a gala for a different organization, a celebration of Atlanta's top nonprofits. Delilah was being honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award, and Sterling accompanied her as her guest and partner. As they walked into the ballroom, Delilah remembered the last gala she had attended in this same venue. She remembered the fear and humiliation. She remembered Sterling's hand tight on her elbow as he steered her away from his colleagues. She remembered the moment her name was called, and she walked to that stage having no idea her life was about to change completely. This time was different. This time, Sterling's hand on her back was gentle and supportive. This time, when people approached them, Sterling introduced Delilah with pride and stepped back to let her shine. This time, Delilah walked into the room knowing exactly who she was and what she had built. When she accepted her award, Delilah spoke about the importance of believing in yourself even when others do not. She talked about the danger of letting other people's doubts or dismissiveness determine your sense of what is possible. And she talked about the courage it takes to keep showing up for your vision even when the path is unclear and the support is sparse. 5 years ago, Delilah said from the stage, I was in a room very similar to this one, and someone I loved treated me in a way that made me question my worth. But that moment, as painful as it was, became a turning point. It forced me to confront hard truths about how I had been allowing myself to be diminished. It forced me to choose whether I would accept that treatment or demand better. And I chose to demand better, not just from the people around me, but from myself. I chose to stop making myself smaller to fit into someone else's comfort zone. I chose to take up the space my work deserved, and that choice changed everything. The room was silent, hundreds of people hanging on her words. So if you are here tonight and you have been told your work does not matter, or your vision is too ambitious, or you should focus on being more realistic, I want you to know something. The people who tell you to dream smaller are often the people who are afraid of what your big dreams say about their own limited vision. Do not let their fear determine your trajectory. Do not let their discomfort become your ceiling. You are capable of more than you realize. Your work matters more than you know. And the world needs what you have to offer, even if the people closest to you have not figured that out yet. When she returned to her seat, Sterling was crying. Not dramatic sobs, just quiet tears that he wiped away quickly, but Delilah saw them. I am so sorry, he whispered, for every time I made you feel small, for every time I prioritized my ego over your worth, for that night at the gala, and all the nights before it, when I did not see you the way you deserve to be seen. Delilah took his hand. I know, and I have forgiven you. But Sterling, you need to understand something. I did not build all of this to prove anything to you. I did not succeed to make you regret how you treated me. I succeeded because this work matters to me, because these kids deserve it, because I was called to this purpose. Your pride in me now is nice, but it is not why I do what I do. I know, Sterling said, and that is what makes you extraordinary. You did not need my validation. You did not need my permission. You built this anyway, and I am grateful, so grateful, that you gave me the chance to grow into a partner who deserves to stand beside you. After the gala, they went home to their children, both teenagers now, both aware of their mother's work and impact in ways that made Delilah's heart swell. Their daughter had started volunteering at the Heritage Arts programs, teaching younger kids the painting techniques she had learned. Their son had written a school essay about his mother's courage and leadership that had made Delilah cry when she read it. They were building a legacy, not just through the foundation, but through the values they were instilling in their children. And the importance of service, the courage to pursue your purpose even when it is hard, the necessity of treating people with dignity and respect regardless of their position or status. 7 years after the gala, Delilah was invited back to Whitmore Financial for a special event. The company was launching a new initiative focused on supporting women entrepreneurs and nonprofit leaders, and they wanted Delilah to keynote the launch. Richard Whitmore, now in his 70s but still sharp and engaged, introduced her personally. 7 years ago, Richard said, we invited Delilah Harrison to host our annual gala's silent auction because we had heard impressive things about her foundation's work. What we did not know at the time was that Delilah was married to one of our portfolio managers. And what we definitely did not know was that her own husband had been hiding her light under a bushel, so to speak, because he was more concerned with appearances than with recognizing the extraordinary woman he had married. The room was silent, people shifting uncomfortably. This was not the usual corporate happy talk. That night became a turning point, not just for Delilah, though it clearly was that, but for our organization, because we realized that we had been overlooking incredible talent in leadership, particularly among women and people of color, because we were not looking in the right places or asking the right questions. We realized that the old boys network mentality was causing us to miss out on partnerships and perspectives that could make us better. Richard paused and looked directly at Sterling, Amr, who was sitting in the front row. And it became a turning point for Sterling Harrison, who had to confront some hard truths about his own biases and insecurities. Sterling, would you like to share what you learned? Sterling stood, clearly prepared for this moment. I learned that my value as a person and as a professional was not diminished by my wife's success, that her achievements did not make me smaller, they made our family stronger. I learned that partnership means celebrating your spouse's gifts rather than feeling threatened by them. And I learned that integrity matters more than image, always. The room erupted in applause. When it was Delilah's turn to speak, she talked about the importance of corporate cultures that truly value diversity and inclusion, not just as buzzwords, but as operating principles. She challenged the companies in the room to look at how they were identifying and supporting talent, particularly among people who did not fit traditional molds. The leaders you need might not look like the leaders you have had in the past, Delilah said. They might not come from the same schools or the same neighborhoods or the same networks. They might be working mothers balancing multiple responsibilities. They might be people who started nonprofits in church basements rather than people with Ivy League MBAs. But they have vision and dedication and the kind of authenticity that cannot be taught. Your job is to recognize that talent and create space for it to flourish. After her speech, dozens of people approached Delilah to talk about partnerships, funding opportunities, and ways they could support the Heritage Arts Network's continued expansion. Sterling stood nearby, clearly proud, but he did not insert himself into the conversations. He let Delilah shine. On the drive home, Sterling said, "Thank you." For what? For giving me the chance to become a better person, for not giving up on our marriage when you had every right to, for showing me what real leadership looks like. Delilah smiled. You did the work, Sterling. I just set the boundary. You chose to respect it and grow from it. Still, I am grateful. 10 years after the gala, Delilah stood in the ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton once again, this time for a celebration of the Heritage Arts Network's 10th anniversary and expansion to 25 cities. Over 10,000 children were being served annually. NASA and the organization had become a national model for arts education access. Sterling was there, as were their children, now young adults pursuing their own passions and purposes. Richard Whitmore was there, retired now but still engaged with the organization as an advisory board member. Carolyn Jenkins was there, having become one of Delilah's closest friends and mentors. As Delilah looked around the room at all the people who had supported this journey, she thought about that night 10 years ago. She thought about the humiliation and the hurt. She thought about the moment she heard her name called and walked to the stage not knowing what was coming, but walking anyway. She thought about how that moment of pain had become a catalyst for profound change. Not just in her marriage, though, that mattered, but in her understanding of her own worth and power. Because the truth was, Delilah had always been extraordinary. She had always been building something meaningful. The gala had not made her successful. It had just made her success visible to people who had not been paying attention. including her husband. And while Sterling's recognition and pride mattered, while his growth and change were real and important, Delilah knew that her value had never been dependent on his acknowledgement. She had built the Heritage Arts Network because children deserved access to arts education. She had persevered through doubts and dismissals because the work mattered more than anyone's opinion of it. That was the real lesson of the past 10 years. Not that Sterling had changed, though he had. Not that she had forgiven him, though she had. But that she had learned to see herself the way others had seen her all along. As a leader, as a visionary, as someone whose work was changing lives and whose voice deserved to be heard. The husband who once introduced her as the maid now introduced her as the most accomplished person he knew. But Delilah did not need that introduction anymore. She knew who she was. She knew what she had built. She knew her worth. And that knowledge, hard-won and tested, was the foundation of everything else she would accomplish. As the celebration continued around her, Delilah smiled. Not because everything was perfect, but because she had taken the worst moment of her marriage and transformed it into fuel for building something extraordinary. She had turned humiliation into power. She had turned dismissal into determination. Once she had turned pain into purpose. And in doing so, she had proven that sometimes the people who underestimate you just give you the motivation to prove how wrong they were. Not for their sake, but for yours. The gala had been 10 years ago. The hurt had faded. The marriage had healed. But the lesson remained. Know your worth. Do the work. Let the results speak for themselves. And never ever let anyone make you feel like you are less than extraordinary. Because you are not the help. You are the hero of your own story. And sometimes the people who should have seen that from the beginning finally figure it out. And sometimes they do not. Either way, you keep building. You keep serving. You keep showing up for your purpose. And that, Delilah knew, was the real triumph.